I'm an MD, and this actually happened to me during my year as an intern. I was in a night shift in the Labour and Delivery or L&D ward, located on the 4th floor of the hospital. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a call from one of the nurses in the 5th floor, which was the Department of Pathology of Pregnancy ward. The nurse told me that one of the patients needed new labs for a procedure that was scheduled for later that day, around 7 a.m., basically requesting that I draw the samples around 4 or 5 a.m. As Labour and Delivery was, for some reason, almost deserted that night, being proactive, I chose to go and draw the samples, just in case some emergency would happen later during the shift that would keep me from doing it. As I was taking the stairs to the 5th floor, I just felt how the temperature dropped to the point I got chills. And as I was reaching the last steps, I was facing downwards while I was going up. I began to look up. That's when I saw the lower body of a child in a hospital robe, barefoot. Mind you, I froze and could not look up all the way. The skin was ashy grey, and the blood vessels were all black. I felt a strong putrid smell whipping up. Without much more processing on my part, I just stumbled backwards, almost falling down, and ran for dear life back to the Labour and Delivery ward. When I got to the door, one of the security guards took one look at my face and said, "Ah, you saw something too?" I shakily told him what had just happened. Basically, he told me that the child was not the only thing that lurked there, and to always be careful when I walked through the hospital at night. Safe to say that when it was 5 a.m, I went back to draw the samples, just like the nurse had told me to begin with. Maybe she already knew of the spooky things that go on down there, so I learned that it was better to stick to schedules. It was definitely an awful experience. I've got a couple stories. A little backstory. I'm in the Air Guard, and we had a chance to go help out a few hospitals because of COVID, so I decided to go help out the hospital staff. When I was there, I got tasked to help with housekeeping, so cleaning rooms. I did night shift in the ER. Usually there's only one other person that actually works there to help when needed. Story 1. For the first month, I didn't really realize anything out of the ordinary, except the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't really think much about it, because, well, I was in my military uniform cleaning rooms of people who had got released or passed away. This one time, I felt that there was something more than just people watching me. When I was in a room, just me, and I just had this weird type of dread of being watched by something. While I was cleaning the room, it felt like there was someone there, just in the corner, but I couldn't see them. Towards the end, right when I was about to leave, I felt extremely cold. Not like a weird chill, a type of death chill almost. It was such a weird feeling, something I never felt before. After I left, I just felt so scared till I relaxed. I don't understand what could have caused it, or how I got so cold in a matter of seconds. Story 2. This also happened in the ER, while I was by myself again. How fun. So in the hospital, all the soap and hand sanitizers are all motion activated. It started out as a slow night, about 2 rooms an hour. After about 8 hours, I was nearing the end of my shift. I had 1 more room to clean. As I was cleaning, I started to have the feeling I was being watched, so I just ignored the feeling. probably not the best idea, as you'll see. After about 5 minutes of feeling that I was being watched, I started cleaning the bed, which was the last thing I had to do. As I was cleaning, the soap dispenser went off, even though I was the only person there. I ignored it, as I was going to clean it before I left. Not even 30 seconds later, I heard footsteps in the bathroom, and me being me, I decided to look to see if anyone was in there. As soon as I poked my head around, I got so cold and got instant goosebumps. So I left the room and I started cleaning a public bathroom for the last 30 minutes of my shift. As I was cleaning the bathroom, the towel dispenser just kept spitting out paper towel after paper towel. After that, I was done with my shift and left. I don't know what could cause those things to happen or how they do it, but definitely one of the weirdest and scariest moments I've experienced. So this actually happened to a co-worker of mine, but it's by far the creepiest thing I've ever been semi-involved with in my entire life, and I've been waiting for the perfect time to share. This was a few years ago now, but I work in a hospital, and there are privacy laws, so I just wanted to give it some time to be safe. So I had this co-worker, we'll call him Jack for the sake of this story, who I trained and worked with quite a lot. One day I came to work, I actually think it might have been around the holidays, and he had told me that he had had a phone call that really creeped him out. We work in a call center, transferring patient and employee calls. He said that a patient had called in the early hours of the morning, wanting to speak to the nurse in charge. As is protocol, Jack took the patient's name, doctor's name, and phone number. He then told the patient the nurse would call him back ASAP. The patient asked her to hurry, sounding to be in great distress according to Jack, and insisted he was having a cardiac arrest. We aren't allowed to give medical advice of any kind, but we are allowed to encourage patients in distress to call 911 or go to the ER. So Jack did so, but the guy insisted on waiting for the nurse. Jack put the guy on hold, not wanting to make him wait, and called the nurse. While waiting for her to call back, the line dropped. When the nurse called back, Jack gave her the info and moved on with his night. The nurse shortly called back and asked Jack to repeat the phone number. He did, and she said that it must be wrong, as she was getting one of those "this number isn't assigned to anyone" messages when she tried to call. She decided to look up the patient's file to confirm the number herself. Only problem is, the patient died over 20 years ago. Jack seemed to believe the patient died of cardiac arrest. Of course, I have no way of knowing that myself. The phone number, by the way, was correct, and Jack had it checked with caller display while on the call. He would read the numbers to the patient and ask them to confirm. So it was definitely the number the patient called from, despite the number being out of service and the patient being dead for over 20 years. To this day, we still don't know what happened or how this was possible. For some background, I've been a behavioral health nurse for about 12 years. My first job was at a freestanding mental health facility in the south. This facility is pretty uniquely constructed, as it was originally a plantation owned by a wealthy Irishman who emigrated here sometime in the 1700s. The original plantation house is still there and is now used as the business office, and the hospital itself was constructed to be attached to the house. If you explore the campus, there's a small graveyard with the original owner's tombstone, as well as some other family members of his. Additionally, there is a sign that says something along the lines of, "This is dedicated to the slaves that worked and died on this plantation." Anyway, one of the stories that has been passed down among the employees there for decades is that a young girl in the Irishman's family, or one of his daughters or grandchildren, passed away on the plantation at a really young age, that her ghost still lingers around the house and the facility, and that there are certain patients' rooms that have an unusual amount of paranormal activity. One day, I was walking past one of these rooms, and in my peripheral, I saw a young girl who looked to be about 9 or 10 years old, sitting on the bed. She was wearing a colonial-looking dress, appropriate for the time period in which she was alive, and looked at me directly in the eyes when I turned to look at her. I was incredibly startled, and my mind raced for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that she wasn't there. I walked a few feet past the room, gathered my courage to go back, and she had disappeared from sight. She didn't have any ethereal qualities, nothing otherworldly or strange. She literally just looked like a real person sitting right there in plain view. During my time there, I never heard of anyone else who saw her as clearly as I did, but every once in a while, one of my co-workers or patients would experience something strange, like doors opening and slamming shut. I remember one patient in particular that ran out of his room white as a sheet and said that while he was lying in his bed, his bathroom door slammed on its own. It was so loud, I heard it from the nurse's station myself. This patient was there for addiction and had no history of hallucinations. Just thought I'd share. My mum was a VP at our local hospital, and when the hospital was purchased and made public, they got a brand new hospital built for them. The main priority on move day was obviously getting all the clients to the new hospital safely, and the equipment and medicine. The old hospital was locked after that, but was still being used as storage, so staff could go back and get less important items over time. Only 3 people had access to the hospital, with the key and security code for the alarm, and my mum was one of them. If someone had to return to the old hospital for something, they had to be attended by one of the 3 key holders. So my mum told me in the beginning, it didn't feel too weird, just felt like being in an empty building, but the longer it was abandoned is when the weird stuff started happening. When she had to visit the site with the VP over construction, when a big storm hit and damaged the roof over ICU, so they had to investigate the damage, my mum went to her old office first, because she was like, well, since I'm here, I may as well grab a few items that are still left behind. She heard music playing down the hall when she left, and just assumed her colleague was on the same floor and wanted noise to be less freaked out. He hated going there. She went to the 5th floor, which was the site of the damage, and her colleague was there, so she asked if he had just come to the ground floor as well, and he said, "No, why? I came directly to the 5th floor." Like I said, this building was heavily alarmed, and only 2 other colleagues had access with my mum already there, and the alarm resets once you've entered the building, so if one of the others had come to it, it would have triggered the alarm again before disarming it, so there was definitely no one in the building with them. I asked my mum if I could go with her the next time she had to visit, which was soon, so she could let the construction team in, and the reason for fixing the abandoned building is, like I said, still using it for storage and didn't want rodents getting in through the hole in the ceiling. And there were a few things I experienced directly. Basically, anything that didn't affect the bottom line in terms of budget just got left behind. I knew this hospital really well because I basically grew up there. I would go there after school until my mum was done with work and would hang out in her office or visit patients, and I volunteered there over the summers once I got older, so it was a bit sad to see it so abandoned and disheveled. What was the cafeteria was just stacked with old chairs, broken gurneys, broken equipment. Some hallways just had random gurneys left behind, so that gave it an eerie feeling too. A lot of people in town refused to drive by it as well, because they got a very off-putting feeling too. Anyway, here's what I noted when I went with my mum. Only the generator to the building was on, full electricity was cut off, but room lights would turn on by themselves as you walked by. Phones that were disconnected would ring as you walked by offices. The nurse's station help pad that patients would buzz from their room rang as well, and the ringing would follow us, as in stop ringing on the one side of the wing and start ringing on the other once you got closer to a different nursing station. Patient call lights would turn on as you walked by rooms, and these were lights the patients operated from their beds. No beds and no other light switch to operate them. The pharmacy alarm was just constantly going off, and there was no way to stop it. The construction guys were of course freaked out and wanted to make sure electricity was actually cut off before they started working because of all the lights and alarms, and my mum was like, "Yep, I can show you." They said that was going to be the quickest job they ever completed. The colleague that was with my mum for the damage inspection went to the hospital early one day, waiting for the arrival of someone with security clearance, and saw that on the 5th floor in ICU, a window was open. When the hospital was locked up, all windows were bolted from the inside, meaning they'd have to be smashed from the outside or unscrewed from the inside, and he saw a shadowy figure just peering out from the window at him, and he noped the hell out of there. Like I said, the building was alarmed and monitored, and there also wouldn't have been a reason for that window to be opened, and it would have taken effort. I went to the hospital one night and just stayed outside, but I went to take pictures to see if I could capture anything. Random lights were on that shouldn't be on with just the generator running. I was with a friend, and all of a sudden, something tapped on the glass from the inside. The hospital was basically all windows, just with beams separating each panel, if that makes sense. I waited a few moments, then looked at my friend and said, "You heard that, right?" I didn't specify what I had heard, and he said, "Yeah, some tapping on the glass at us." My camera had been fully charged and suddenly just died. I was like, okay, we're out of here. Got home and plugged it in, and it immediately popped up, and it's near full charge. When the hospital was still running, there was a presence in the ER the staff referred to as Rose. They only messed with one room, couldn't control the temperature in there. It could get so cold there would be condensation on the glass. The equipment in there would go berserk. The sink would just turn itself on. When new doctors or nurses would start, they would say, "This machine needs to be swapped or examined for malfunction," or whatever, and all the veteran staff would say, "Nah, it's just Rose messing with it." One surgeon refused to operate in a certain room in ICU. He asked my mum if he could bring a priest in to perform an exorcism on it. She let him, and I think he felt better walking by it after that, but still refused to enter or see patients in it. My mum is a very practical lawyer, and she said working at a hospital for any amount of time would turn the biggest skeptic into a believer. They finally gave in and knocked it down and sold it for the land. Initially they had it in the budget to sell for 5 mil, but as you can imagine, not many people are in the market for an abandoned hospital from the 60s. It was there for a long time though. The new hospital was moved into in 2010, and the old hospital wasn't knocked down until 2019. I'm not sure what they're building on the land. I would think residential, like an apartment complex. That should be interesting, seeing as the land is also directly across from a cemetery. I'm not scared of this stuff, but if I knew I was renting an apartment built on land where a hospital was and was directly across from a cemetery, I'd be like, no thank you. I'm a therapist in a small rural hospital in the Midwest. This experience occurred during one of our COVID waves in the month of September in the year 2020. I had a patient on my caseload at the time who I'll refer to as Herbie. Herbie was an older man who unfortunately had caught COVID and was not doing too well with it. My job was to come visit with him during his stay to assist with him completing exercises, using the restroom, getting cleaned up, etc., to help him stay active in the hospital in the hopes that if he recovered, he would not be too debilitated. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Herbie and I had a good rapport. We were both Catholics and enjoyed talking about the various goings-on of our diocese, talking about the priests, some of the beautiful older churches in our area, and discussing his life up until this point. He just had work finished on a cabin that he was planning on spending the remainder of his life in, and really missed his dog. I remember Justice Ginsburg had recently passed away, and this was on the news every time I came to see him. Herbie's health did begin to take a turn for the worse, but I was sure to make time to come see him, even just to do something simple, so I would have the opportunity to keep him company for a little while. He had been in the hospital for a week at this point. We assured each other of our prayers every time we had to say goodbye. My manager needed my help on our inpatient rehabilitation floor one day, and I was unable to see him. Late that night, I sat down to pray the rosary. I'm pretty serious about my faith, and so I sometimes like to set the mood, so to speak, when I pray, to aid in my meditations on the mysteries. I'll sometimes light some candles and burn some incense to create a chapel-like atmosphere. It had to have been a Tuesday because I was praying the sorrowful mysteries. I could not keep my mind off Herbie the entire time I was praying, and was distracted to the point that I stopped to try and clear my mind. I then noticed that the incense I was burning, a stick incense, was producing an uninterrupted flow of smoke all the way up to my ceiling, with no breaks or curling, yet my 2 candles were flickering like crazy. The vibe in the room really changed when I noticed that, but I refocused and then finished the rosary. Still though, I was unable to keep my mind off Herbie. When I finished, I put my rosary away and sat there for a few minutes to think about what was happening. The incense and the candles were still acting strangely. I didn't feel a chill or anything like that, but then I heard a very strange sound that I can't easily explain. The best I can say is that it had a garbled or guttural quality to it. Me hearing a sound at all is pretty unusual because I have profound hearing loss, and without my hearing aids in, I usually take them out when I get home. There's a lot of noises that I simply will not hear. Then, my phone from the opposite end of the room to me began to go off. I get up and shut the thing off, and I'm feeling pretty on edge. My phone was on the Google Assistant screen, where you can talk to it to have it look things up or whatever, and the time read 1:17 a.m. At this point, I think I have an idea of what may have happened, and I'm sure anyone listening to this does too. I fell asleep that night, praying Hail Marys for Herbie. The next morning, the very first thing I did when I signed on to our patient information program was look up Herbie. He had indeed passed away that night at 1:12 a.m. I was stunned. I went to the nurses' station at our COVID wing to try to get some information about what had happened that night, but of course, there was another crew of nurses there. I heard through the grapevine months later that there were many patients who begged for time with a priest for last rites, anointing of the sick, and so on. But these requests were ignored or denied since there was a strict no-visitor policy in effect at the time. Besides that, I don't think the diocese would have allowed priests to enter the building anyway. I'll leave my opinions on the whole situation on that side for now. I've sat on this story for a few years, and I've only shared it with my family and some of my closer friends. It had an effect on me that I struggled to explain. I considered going to a priest to discuss it, but have never worked up the nerve to do so. I just don't think any of the priests in my area would be very helpful. And if I'm being brutally honest, I'm still carrying a stone in my heart that the priests did not advocate more strongly for our dying patients at the time. It feels nice to get this story out in a somewhat more public way. This started in December 2020. As part of my education, I was scheduled for a 6-month internship at a psychiatric hospital. I had previous experience with working with these types of patients, so I was really excited about it. I switched around the 4 different wards in the hospital, so I treated lots of different people with lots of different problems. I was curious about the different aspects, so I never said no to a task, which meant I came across everything from murderers to pedophiles to suicidal teenagers with personality disorders. In my work life, I've had people spit at me, verbally and physically assault me, throw crap at me, and all that stuff, so I like to think I'm a pretty tough guy. And besides that, I always carried a personal assault alarm. One press of a button, and the staff from every ward would be there in a matter of seconds. On one of the wards, I quickly noticed there was a certain room which was monitored 24/7 by a guard. To be clear, this is a pretty normal procedure, either because the patient is physically abusive, suicidal, or restrained, but most patients get the watch pulled off them relatively quickly. I asked a colleague, and she told me it was a female patient, let's just call her Anne, who was extremely aggressive and psychotic beyond belief. At that point, Anne had been restrained in her bed for 3 months. I could not believe what I was hearing. We have really strict procedures when it comes to restraining people with belts. By the way, they're soft belts made of fabric, not leather, so restraining the patient really is the absolutely last resort we go to. I asked the chief psychiatrist what was up with this girl, and he just scoffed and said, if only I knew, but honestly, she defies logic. He told me that at first, they thought she was psychotic, but her symptoms only got worse, no matter how many different medications they tried. Then they thought she might have suffered a trauma and was in a dissociative state, but that still didn't fit her profile of symptoms. She had gone from being a perfectly normal woman in her 20s to being violent, extremely aggressive, and unable to speak in just 4 months. That is practically unheard of, especially as no drugs were involved. We regularly make toxicology checks of all patients, and always when they're admitted. One day, my alarm went off. They're all connected, so I know where I need to run to help my colleagues. I immediately knew it had to be Anne, and I was right. She had only had her legs and torso fixated, Again, normal procedure if the patient is otherwise relatively calm. She had defecated on her hand and thrown it on a guard watching her. She then proceeded to bite her fingers so hard that 3 or 4, I can't remember the exact number, had really bad fractures. Both her hands were a bloody mess, and she needed like 50 stitches afterwards. It wasn't the blood, or the fact that she would throw her own filth at us. I had seen that loads of times. But the screams this woman made, it was the most primal, guttural, and terrifying sounds I have ever heard. It scared me. The best way I can describe it is something like a bear growling, and a mountain lion hissing and spitting at the same time. I've seen my fair share of people in primal distress, but I could never have imagined that a person could make a sound like that. As an intern, I am in no way allowed to use force, so I was just watching as 7 of my colleagues tried to fixate her fully to her bed. They had serious trouble pinning her down. Mind you, these are really experienced people. At last, we called a medical alarm, which immediately calls for the chief psychiatrist to make decisions. He decided to forcefully medicate her. They gave her 1 and then a second shot. It only seemed to piss her off, even though it should have put a bear to sleep. At the 3rd injection, she calmed enough so that they could restrain her. She never nodded off, she just breathed heavily and kept staring up at the same corner of the room, sometimes smirking at something only she could see. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back at the ward. It was a relatively calm weekend, so there really wasn't much to do. Anne was in one of her good periods, so she had had her restraints removed. A guard was always by her though. I was sitting in the office when suddenly I see Anne walking in the hallway without the guard. I don't know if he had taken a bathroom break or whatever, but he wasn't around. So I caught up with her and asked her what she was doing in the hallway alone, but of course she didn't respond. I should mention that many of my colleagues were afraid of Anne, and rightfully so, even though everyone is aware that it's the illness and not the person attacking you. But when it keeps happening, that patient does catch some stigma. For one, I always try to look at the person and not the illness, so I asked where we were going. She took me by the arm and led me to the common area. She went over to a book cabinet, turned and looked at me, and muttered, "Read book." I was completely taken aback by the fact she was speaking. She pulled out a random book and handed it to me. She then sat down on the floor and started rocking back and forth. I joined her on the floor and started reading the book. It was just some random old book, probably from a charity, and it had no special meaning. But as I read, she came closer and closer to me. She then cuddled up to me, put her head on my lap, and fell asleep. One of my colleagues came by, and she looked absolutely shocked, and before I knew it, 5 or 6 people, including the chief psychologist, was looking at me reading this random book out to her. I caught a lot of praise for this, which is always nice. But then, things took a turn for the worse, for me at least. It started one night when I was home alone. It was a completely normal night for me, until I heard something from upstairs coming downstairs. The best way to describe it is like a big dog thrashing and tumbling down the stairs. You know, like when a dog rushes down the stairs to greet you. But this was bigger, much bigger. I could hear the weight of something tumbling down, while nails and claws or whatever slid on the steps. I got up, thinking that somehow there was a massive animal in my house, but there was nothing there. That scared the ever-living crap out of me. I had never had anything like that happen to me. I left the house and stayed the night with my parents, but I also had strange effects on my body, like I had a filter over my eyes or something. Everything started to seem out of focus, like tunnel vision, but with a massive blur added to it. And then I started to disassociate. I had this feeling of being totally out of contact with my body. Then came the panic attacks. My girlfriend called an ambulance one of the times because I was on the verge of a heart attack. The paramedics said I had a heart rate of 240 BPM. I had no prior problems with my psyche, but I figured it was stress. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before, but never with hallucinations, or whatever you want to call it. But that started recently. I see a large black mass with long arms and legs sit in the top corner of our bedroom, like a massive spider, but just with 4 legs. This is now happening on a nightly basis. A couple of days ago, I told my girlfriend about it because she kept pestering me with questions about my nightmares. She said, "That's funny. Every time you're just about to go to sleep, you look up in that corner and you sort of smirk." That reminded me of Anne, and now I'm absolutely terrified that I might have brought something home. Believe it or not, that's up to you. I have never treated a patient like Anne, and none of my colleagues had either. It was scary stuff, and I have never suffered any psychological problems before. Never. But something is going on. I'm sure of it. It feels like it wants to get back at me or something. I don't know. And by the way, Anne is much better today. She's in a rehabilitating home where she thrives. One day, she might even be able to have her own normal life back. I work as security for a hospital in Texas. This hospital has seen its fair share of deaths and freaks. We've had more than enough tragic, near-miss, and absolutely preventable deaths. We get at least one meth addict talking about demons every single week. I started working as a man who seriously wasn't into the paranormal scene. I knew that some things couldn't be explained, but that 99.999% could. To this day, I still look for those explanations before deciding something is spooky. I'm throwing this out there because the spooky stuff is very much escalating in both frequency and in degree. I don't want to think that someone's going to actually be affected by these things, but I'm really not a fan. I'm going to give a quick list of reported spooky areas, the events in them, and the general time period before I get to what made me write this. It's all within 2 years, so it's not long. Primarily, the areas are closed and empty. In one of our 3 towers, the ER, and our new office, primarily, but not exclusively. The first 6 weeks in the ER, non-auto doors opening on their own to let people through, bathrooms that lock themselves with deadbolts. They can't lock and close, and they're too stiff to just trigger because you close it hard. In the closed unit, all sorts of noises and movement, the odd groan, moan or whimper, and general sense of being watched. I ran into something that looked like a staff member I had never seen before or since, staring dead into his little rolling trash can, completely motionless, expressionless, dead fish-like. When the fragment of a thought to look into his trash can rose, I felt every single fiber of my body slam my mind with a heavy "don't." Never felt that before or since, and I've faced knives, potential shooters, and built men on PCP, completely unarmed and alone. In the hallways, secondary footsteps when I'm walking alone down a hallway. Different gear doesn't affect it, nor is it recreated in similar or seemingly the same circumstances. For the next year, I've mostly dealt with the same type of things as in the first 6 weeks, minus Trash Can Boy. Seemed like a pretty steady frequency as well. In a closed unit, since it was built into a unit but still unused, I saw a female in scrubs enter a room of the far side of the west hallway, check every single room, closet and bathroom, find nothing. I see the same woman perform the same movements on the opposite end of the east hallway. Another time, rounding with the other officer, and clearly seeing bare, Caucasian feet peeking from a shower. I quickly pull the shower curtain and find nobody. While walking with a different officer, I turn the corner and check behind me and see an older Caucasian female in the act of crawling towards me, with right hand reaching for my left ankle, about 6 inches from contact, gone when I turn around. In the new office, I often hear deliberate, people-like sounds from the empty half, mostly dropping things that aren't on the ground, and clear knocking. I heard a non-existent metallic object drop between 2 officers on the open side. I saw a reflection of a nurse walk across a window in such a way that would put her on our side and through a wall. I've had missing keys that appear in a 5-time checked location while I was the only one there. Yesterday, our new office was empty for 2 to 3 minutes. Hardly anyone has access, and those who do, hardly any of them have access to our director's office. When I returned, I walked through the closed side as usual. Our broom was leaning against the door and smacked my hip when I opened the door, and our director's door was wide open. The only other officer was visible on cameras somewhere else, and our director was preoccupied somewhere else. Audible noises were very active the rest of the day. Today, I had an unsettling feeling the 3 hours I was in there. I found a small trash can by me that moved a solid foot while I was alone. That haunted door opened itself twice when I made sure it was closed each time. When I left to go somewhere more populated, I heard frantic running right behind me as soon as I opened the door. I closed it immediately out of surprise, but saw nobody from the door window, which can see everywhere one would walk. To be clear, I had an instinctive reaction to jump and use the door as a shield before I even really knew that I was moving. This has been escalating like nuts within the last couple of months, but I'm not sure why. Since before I was hired, multiple officers and even medical staff have had unique and shared experiences, some different from my own. The 2 other supervisors saw the same shadow person, but never knew until I told them that the other one saw the same thing. Some updates. November 4, 21. I was just walking behind a doctor in a hallway. We hit an intersection with another hallway. There are no doors in the immediate area around the intersection. Despite this, he somehow disappeared within the 4 seconds that it took me before I turned the same corner. I didn't hear any heavy footfalls that had implied running, and there are no doors he would have reached by then, particularly in that hallway, as the only doors would be a good 12 seconds or so going at this place. I thought I was walking behind a doctor, but now I'm not so sure. November 18, 21. In our security office, I heard some footsteps in the back, where we keep the door closed from. On night shift, there's not usually a reason for being back there, so I opened the door. Nobody, and the footsteps stopped. I closed the door and went to walk away, but heard the footsteps again. I could hear the footsteps go back and forth down the short hallway. When I listened harder, I could even hear the heel or flat sound of casual walking. I threw the door open this time when the steps came up to the door, and there was nobody there. I said out loud, "Hey, stop being so loud when I'm the only one here," and left the office to do a round around the hospital. No footsteps when I returned with another officer. I'm a somewhat nihilistic person with no real fear of anything that's actually threatening, except that death is coming from shooters, meth addicts with knives, and the ghost. Scared of heights, the ocean, and space. I know, I'm ass backwards and dumb. Being such, I didn't spare a thought the first time I was having a frustrating day at work and hearing constant noise from the then locked haunted side, telling it something along the lines of, "Yo, can you just chill for now? You can act up whenever things calm down for all I care. To my surprise, the activity dropped almost immediately and didn't act up again until the next couple of days. I've pulled that maneuver 2 other times, or 3 including today, in similar circumstances. I try not to pull that too often, mostly because I want the seeming respect of my frustration to stay strong. I've even told my partner supervisor that if he's in a similar situation, he could try to pull the same thing. I don't think he has, but still. I also try to keep my tone strong, but not aggressive, and to not outright deny the entity of acting up. I always add that it can act up under different circumstances, rather than just telling the thing that I don't understand to stop in general until the end of time. November 20th, 21. During pass down with the supervisor I relieve, I heard footsteps coming from the haunted section of our office. I checked it with him and found nothing, but the noises stopped. As soon as we get close to the door again, the footsteps began again and have continued. He also told me that earlier in the shift, he was hearing so many sounds next door that he assumed multiple people were in. While he was writing reports, he expected someone from the cleaning crew to come in, but they never did. So he checked the next door area and found absolutely nobody. There was so much noise that he thought that there were multiple individuals in there. Apparently no voices though, but all that stopped when he opened the door. February 18, 22. My partner supervisor and his officer were walking through one of the units on one of our towers. This unit was empty at the time. As they walked past one of the nurses' stations, one of the chairs rolled into the pathway of the other side of it. February 24, 22. My partner supervisor and his officer told me about their experience when rounding in a unit that is currently empty. Due to lack of staff, we filled the old abandoned unit by basically shutting down a couple others. They told me that they heard the sound of something heavy being dragged on the floor above them. This would be understandable given that there are 2 doors above that one, except for the fact that all noise is kept to each unit. We've had full running, shouting, ground fights, and so on these floors, and nothing penetrates the floors. There are things in between the floors that make noise, mostly pipes and tubes, but nothing can be described as dragging something heavy. February 26, 22. I got a call to unlock a bathroom on one of our towers. The woman's restroom on every floor of one of our towers has a habit of locking itself. They're all a deadbolt that requires a decent amount of force, and they resist slamming. We tried. We've even stalked the cameras to see if someone did it, but have seen multiple times that people will leave the bathroom normally. Someone will come and try the door, and the next people entering will be security with a key. So my partner supervisor and I recognized that this was for one of these bathrooms. We bring our skeptic officer with us and go to unlock one of these doors. We knock and call to anybody inside before trying the handle, and finding it locked, we open it with the keys and find nobody inside. The skeptic can't find a good reason for it, and especially considering it's only ever been the women's restrooms, 5 in total, that have the same rough location per floor of a single tower. No other restroom does this, and no other tower has this issue. February 27, 22. Small event, but I still can't figure it out. I was alone in our office and began to leave to do a round. As I was maybe 3 steps from the door, I heard the distinct sound of a person knocking. Not wood being knocked on, but someone knocking one of those little tunes that people do. It took me less than 4 seconds to open the door, but nobody was there. In that time, someone would have had to sprint to get out of eyesight, and that's only in one direction. When I asked a nearby staff member that was dealing with visitors if they saw someone move from our direction, she said no. I had already been hearing quite a bit of extra noises in the spooky side of our office. but had been actively pretending to not notice until then. Needless to say, I felt uncomfortable knowing that I had just walked through a haunt or something. 18th of March 22. My partner supervisor apparently saw something. He was in the office with the lights off, with one of his 2 officers, with the other having gone somewhere not long before. After a few minutes, he saw somebody with a similar build to the officer that was out of the office, standing right at the door to the haunted section, but neither of the 2 heard the door open. He claimed that he assumed that was his outside officer, and even mentioned how quick his return was to the person at the door. Apparently, when he looked and spoke to it, the person turned and walked into the property room. This was unsettling because 1. The old property rooms in the haunted section and the new ones on our side are the most haunted rooms in the office, and 2. The door was only cracked open, meaning that the person would have had to have walked through the door. Naturally, that's when he turned on the lights and investigated the property room, finding nothing and nobody. Based on his expression and way of speaking, I do believe him. The officer that he mistook that thing for was fine, and is acting normally right next to me as I write this. 19th of March 22. Holy moly, this thing is getting braver. With 3 of us in the office, including my partner supervisor, this thing or these things are having a heyday with the noises. One of these noises sounded like a pen being dropped in the property room after we were throwing pens around in our room. When my partner supervisor and I were facing each other, I was looking down the hallway while his back was facing the hallway. Due to the low red lighting, I would see flickers of what I thought was movement in the new property room, but they would be gone when I focused on the location. That is until I focused on the area and saw a humanoid head and shoulders peeking out from inside the new property room. It looked like a 3D black void in the shape of a human, but still seemed to reflect the light to its right, like an actual object. When I made eye contact with it, it slinked back into the property room, pulling an arm that I hadn't noticed it using to lean over with. I debated on whether I even wanted to bring it up to my partner supervisor, but realized that the light was now reflecting what looked like the door, which would mean the door was closed. I asked him if the door was closed, and he said it was. I eventually stood up and checked, and the door was closed. With flashlight on, I opened the door, turned on the light, and saw nothing abnormal inside the room. That means that a figure, similar to what was seen yesterday by someone else, was also seen by me passing through the door, but had totally different movements. I hate to say it, but it feels like it moved from the other side of the hallway and has claimed the new property room. The constant sounds heard by all 3 of us gives me the feeling that it isn't content with just taking a new room. Probably gonna spend the least amount of time in this office as possible tonight. April 7, 22. Came back to work after my weekend. The other night shift supervisor mentioned that he had seen a shadowy figure that peered out from the kitchenette to look at him in a similar way to what I saw. If true, that implies that it's either claimed the room that we use more often than the property room, or it just wanted to let us know that it can move. What's worse is what happened several hours after he left. When I came back to the office after rounding in the hospital, I sat down, leaned back in one of our uncomfortable chairs, and looked at our cameras. Almost immediately after leaning back, I felt the left pocket of my uniform jacket move. It didn't feel like it got hung on something and fell. It felt like it moved up and then fell back down, like something smacked it once I had settled. Unfortunately for it and me, I can't eat my lunch outside, so this may be my final entry. I know that I'm getting a little too used to this kind of thing. June 4th, 22. I'm surprised I'm still working here, but I'm more surprised that I haven't had much to post about. For the most part, I haven't seen, heard, or felt anything inexplicable since my last post. Around a month ago now, I was checking every single unit, looking for a potentially violent individual with a description, and on the famously haunted unit, I took a corner right next to a window and looked in both directions. I saw the reflection of a nurse in the window with an estimated distance of around 7 feet from me and looking at me. But when I turned and went down the hallway, the nearest nurse was on the other side of the unit. I didn't even register that what I saw was very odd until I was a few units down, as the lack of a nurse was not on the same level of demanding thought as searching for the violent individual. Now, this brings me to today. I checked our morgue to see if we had body slings for our crane and to check if we had any bodies. As it turned out, we had exactly one of each. As I'm about to exit, I say something that I considered a jinx and knocked on the wooden stand by the door in a playful fashion. I'm making fun of myself for doing the knock on wood thing. As soon as I take a step towards the door, I hear the exact same knock play from inside the metal shelves the bodies go in. It sounded exactly like my knock, down to the pause and subsequent speed up to make it a tune, rather than just a line of knocking. I also know that it was inside the body shelves because it was very muted. I've knocked and hit and bumped the outside of the unit many a time, mostly by accident. The problem is that the only body in the morgue was on the top shelf, of which we have 2. The knocking sound clearly came from about half a foot off the ground, about in line with the bottom shelf that was empty. Needless to say, I told whatever it was to not do that again unless I invite it, and left. I sincerely hope that I don't have to go in there anytime soon. June 12th, 22. I guess we're getting back into another spooky season. I thought I heard some noises in the haunted section of our office, so checked it out. It wasn't distinct noises, but enough to catch my attention. Finding nothing, I went ahead and changed our thermometer, turned around, and swung the door behind me. As I went back to our side of the office, imagine my confusion when I still heard the thermometer click, but not the door. When I turned around, the door was still wide open. I assumed that I simply thought I swung the door closed, but I became sure that I was repeating the action when I did it again. I could be going crazy, but I remember the feeling of exactly where the door handle pressed on my fingers the first time I swung the door to close it. Knowing that this door in particular has been seen by a few different officers here to just silently open itself despite being closed, as opposed to open like this incident, I'm willing to trust my habits more than the thing that reliably defied common logic. November 7, 22. I stopped logging my experiences for a few months. I've been having some more simple exclusives occasionally, like human activity sounds completely end when I open a door to an empty room, or see a person enter an area that they can't leave from and still somehow be gone when I approach. Simple stuff that isn't targeted and is easy to pretend I didn't notice. Weirdly, pretending I don't see or hear things had resulted in fewer things happening. Though what experiences I have had only further convinces me that I'm either not mad or have lost it so far that it's making other people hallucinate. I've had a new experience a couple of weeks ago. Our pediatric ER is technically part of the main building, but is really only accessible from stepping outside and taking a walk, or going through a long hallway far away from any area a visitor would have any reason of being in. Also, this was about 2 AM, so visitors were not allowed, and any that were around would be hiding in the patient's room, hoping to not be noticed. certainly nowhere near the hallway to the pediatric ER. I was approaching it from the inside, meaning that I was going down the hallway. I saw no visitors in the wide open area that surrounds the hallway entrance, and almost all the sound from outside the hallway dies the second the door closes behind you. Imagine my surprise, well after the door closed behind me, but while I'm still only a third of the way through the hallway, I hear a child laughing behind me. I estimate the voice to be a young child, but older than a toddler. It had that giggle laugh kids have when they're growing up, but haven't become self-conscious of how they sound yet. It also sounded like it came from hip height, which tends to be that age range. Naturally, I turn around. I didn't immediately jump to thinking it was a ghost, but I knew for a fact that no adults were near me, and having a kid off on their own, following grown men into isolated areas, just wasn't a recipe for anything good. I don't know what I expected, because I know there weren't any kids around either, but my job is the first thing I think of when in uniform. There's no kids behind me, obviously. Due to this job, my right ear is a bit hard of hearing, so I assumed that I heard something from the pediatric ER and just got confused. Again, hardly any noise even enters the hallway, but anything to not be ghosts. Unfortunately, this was clearly not the case when I enter the ER and am ambushed with the sounds of 2 or 3 infants just crying their little heads off. To be clear, the hallway is so soundproof that I didn't hear them until I opened the door into the unit. Nothing in this hospital has imitated a child so far. I haven't experienced it, I haven't heard of it. This was a brand new experience that happened only when I was by the pediatric ER and completely isolated. I probably would have quit if I did see a child that wasn't real or alive or whatever. Though I haven't quit despite everything else. I probably should have quit, but what you count as too far or basically normal are really based on past experiences. Here's to hoping this stays far away from becoming basically normal.